Survivors tend to diminish their own experience and say, well, he didn't kill me, so it was not that bad. And that's the bar, like murder. Or it wasn't a stranger, so it's not that bad, as if it was a friend or a lover or an acquaintance, somehow that makes it better. And I was really struck by that, and I just thought, no, actually the things that we diminish really are that bad, no matter what they are. Hey Lydia, I'm sorry we didn't get to read your bio, but I think we'll be okay. Maria, hi. How are you?
I'm very well.
Maria was really kind backstage. She said, I bet you're tired of small talk with strangers. That's why I'm being quiet. It was really kind.
Thank you, Roxane. Can you all hear me? Okay, I'm gonna try to project here. So Roxane, I want to start with some of the connecting threads between hunger and not that bad. For Hunger, you wrote about how you knew it was the next book you had to write because it was the thing that you were most uncomfortable with writing about at that time, and you knew that it was a book that had to exist out in the world. It was a necessary story to tell. And that ultimately you knew it had to be heard. And similarly, in Not That Bad, I imagine it was so difficult for so many of the women who shared their stories to do so. And I wonder if you can tell us what that journey was like for you, from Hunger to Not That Bad, when in Hunger you were sort of forcing space for your voice and your story, and then in Not That Bad, you were providing space for these women and their voices.
I don't know that it was a journey, because I actually sold the books around the same time, and they were like a response to one another for that very reason. I wanted to do more than contribute to the conversation about sexual violence and bodies. I wanted to hear from other people and create space for other people to share those stories. So they were really complementary for me, and two sides of the same coin. And it has worked out pretty well. I think. If I do say so myself. I'm really happy with how the anthology turned out, and I'm okay with how Hunger turned out.
So in Hunger, you write about how your sexual assault forced you to try to erase the memory of the girl you were before that, right? And that she's still there inside of you, in a way. She's frightened and still struggling with shame. And I wonder if you still write to find your way back to that girl. And if so, has the time since the publication of Hunger changed at all in terms of you reaching her, finding her?
I don't know if I'm still writing to reach her as much as I'm writing to honor her and everything she could have been. And it's something I still think about a lot, even though I wish I did. Who would I be if this terrible thing had not happened and drastically changed the course of my life? And I think oftentimes as writers, we write to find answers. And in many ways, I wrote Hunger as a means of trying to answer that question, even though it's not a question that can actually be answered. So I think that it's a combination of things. But mostly now that Hunger is done, and I feel like I've said what I need to say about that, I'm really just writing to honor her and remember her instead of be ashamed of her.
So for Not That Bad, I want to talk a little bit about the title. So you wrote that after you discovered how prevalent sexual violence was, that you repeated to yourself that your own encounter with it, your own encounter with sexual violence was not that bad.
Mm-hmm.
And that in a way that allowed you to compartmentalize your trauma. Can you expand on that?
Definitely. I think a lot of women and a lot of survivors tend to diminish their own experience and say, well, he didn't kill me, so it was not that bad. And that's the bar, like murder. Or it wasn't a stranger, so it's not that bad, as if it was a friend or a lover or an acquaintance, somehow that makes it better. And I was really struck by that, and I just thought, no, actually the things that we diminish really are that bad, no matter what they are. And I was curious to see what other people would think about that, and what they would think about rape culture. Because it's a phrase that we use quite a lot without really thinking about what it means. Sometimes people just say it reflexively, and I'm like, do you know what you're talking about? Or are you just saying those words? And so with the anthology, I really wanted to see how writers would engage with this idea of rape culture, and more importantly, engage with this idea of how we tell ourselves that what we went through was not that bad, to diminish it and to sort of tell ourselves that we need to just walk it off. And I think also sometimes it's a means of self-protection. It wasn't that bad, I'm fine. Or it wasn't that bad, I should be over it. And thus, the anthology.
So it seems to me that not that bad, and both hunger are demanding, not just from society that we listen to them and seek to understand women, but also for women themselves, that we allow ourselves the license to demand to be understood, to demand to be heard.
Absolutely. All too often, women are told to shut up and look pretty. We're told to be small and to be quiet and to not take up space. And we're told that suffering is part and parcel of who we are. And I disagree. And I really think that women should, in whatever way they want, acknowledge their experiences and have those experiences heard. And in both Hunger and Not That Bad, I am creating space for that, for myself and for other women, and also for men who have suffered from sexual harassment or sexual violence, because that is also something that we don't talk about.
You are a survivor of sexual violence, but you don't shun the word victim. And so I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about why you think it's important to not negate this conversation about victimhood to the extent that the dialogue around rape culture revolves solely on survival.
Yeah, you know, it's a very personal choice in terms of what language you want to use to speak to your own experience. But when I first started going to therapy at 14, my therapist gave me a book called The Courage to Heal. And back then, it was the gold standard for sexual violence survivors. And it was heavily predicated on this notion of surviving and finding triumph in the label survivor. And I often struggled with that, with thinking, well, yeah, I'm alive, but that doesn't feel right. And this idea that we need to distance ourselves from victimhood as if there's shame in victimhood. And I don't feel shame in victimhood anymore. And so for me, when I say I was a victim, it's just to honor the fact that suffering happened, that this thing happened to me. And I'm much better, but I don't know that I'm fully over it. And I think it's important to honor that, and that's why I prefer victim over survivor. Though I totally understand why some people prefer survivor, and I support that too. I think it's a personal choice. But oftentimes, there's just this really dominant cultural rhetoric that insists that you call yourself a survivor. We also see it in terms of cancer. And people are like, you know, the brave soldier, and she fought it bravely. Like, if I get cancer, I'm not gonna lie, I'm gonna be fucking miserable and shitty. There is not gonna be one heroic surviving thing about it. I'm gonna be complaining literally every moment. And I'm gonna be just pissed miserable. And so I think it's okay to talk about that, you know, surviving things and enduring things doesn't have to be noble, and it doesn't have to be pretty, and it doesn't have to be inspirational. Like, the worst thing we have ever done is tell women that enduring life requires them to be inspirational.
So in this book, you wanted to explore sexual violence in some form or another as an inevitability in our culture and our society. Where are we on that?
Nowhere. It's interesting, what I originally intended Not That Bad to be is not what it became. What I originally intended the anthology to be was cultural criticism that engaged with the idea of rape culture. I wanted to have people interrogate the phrase itself, and I wanted to have people talk about what it means to live and love and date and have sex in a culture where the phrase rape culture exists. I wanted to see if people were willing to talk about this notion that sometimes it seems like sexual violence is an inevitable part of a woman's life, and that we're just like waiting for our moment. Ever Maynard has a really good rape joke called, where she talks about being accosted on the street and thinking, here's my rape. And so I was really interested in seeing what people think about all that. And I didn't have a specific thing I wanted people to say. I just wanted to see some interrogation. And the submissions that came in, I would say I got around 330 submissions, and probably 310 of them were based in testimony and people speaking to their experiences. And I realized, oh no, we can't get to cultural criticism and sort of a more intellectual approach yet, because we need to talk about what people have actually been through. And so it was really stark and eye-opening. I thought I knew, but to see the number of submissions and the level of suffering out there really reminded me that it is that bad, and that we have quite a long way to go as a culture in terms of dealing with sexual violence. We're not really dealing with it. Thankfully with Me Too, we are starting to see some traction, but are we going to be able to sustain this traction? And are we going to see measurable justice? And what is that justice going to look like when someone like Harvey Weinstein can turn himself in with an appointment that he made, and with the bail check in his pocket? Must be nice, right? That's where we're at, so that's why I say we're nowhere.
In Hunger, you write about loneliness a lot, and part of that stems from, you come from a Haitian American immigrant family, and so growing up you didn't have the same cultural touchstones as African Americans here in the US, but you were also navigating these very white, very privileged spaces. So I wonder how that cultural navigation has shifted as you've gotten older and you're delving into these issues of sexual violence that inevitably intersect with race and class.
I think the older I've gotten, the less I've worried about where I fit in. And the more I've understood that I don't necessarily have to fit in with other people, maybe they need to fit in with me. So a lot of my early writing was very, very tragic. Like, where do I belong? I don't fit in anywhere. But it was honest. That is genuinely how I felt at 19 as a girl from Nebraska who had gone to boarding school in New Hampshire and then college in Connecticut and had spent most of my life in predominantly white spaces. That was a genuine question. And to now move into the space of sexual violence, it's interesting because even in the mainstream media, what we see is predominantly the stories of white women and white upper middle class women. And people think that's what's tragic when women of color deal with sexual violence and do not have the same resources. Since Trump was elected, immigrant women have been going to the police at a far lower rate because they're afraid that ICE is going to cut them. And that's not an irrational fear, that's an actual fear. And we need to talk about that intersection, that not all sexual violence and not all domestic violence is created equal, because people from marginalized communities are suffering in really unspeakable ways right now, particularly those of us who are undocumented.
to revisit a lot of trauma for hunger, and also for Not That Bad, with so many powerful, heartbreaking, and also necessary stories from other women. And now that you say, you were sort of working on them in close proximity of time, was that re-traumatizing for you? Was it cathartic? Was it healing? Was it all those things on different days?
I don't know that it was any of those things, and it was also all of those things. I don't write about things until I'm ready to write about them, so it wasn't re-traumatizing to write Hunger, because it's been many years now, and I've had enough time and distance where I can say, yes, I'm still affected, but I'm okay. And I did drag my heels on writing Hunger, but the hard parts about writing Hunger were not the parts about my assault. It was writing about fatness and living in this world in a fat body, because it's everything. And people don't realize just how biased this world is against fat bodies. I mean, we can even look at this room. And I say that with respect, but I would not sit on that chair. And so to admit that in Hunger, and to admit just how few spaces I can fit in, even with well-meaning people, it was hard. That was the hard part, and that was the traumatizing part, to sort of admit it and to face the shame that I felt about having this body. With Not That Bad, it was really difficult to read the stories of others. It wasn't traumatizing, it was just heartbreaking to see, and also to have to send rejections to most of the people who sent in submissions. Most of the submissions weren't essays. They were really just, this bad thing happened to me. And I had to find a way to say, this isn't ready for public consumption yet. This is, this is therapeutic for you, but what is the reader supposed to take from this? And so it was really challenging to respect people's story and respect their suffering, but also be an editor who has to think about a book that's going to be shared with the public.
So I wonder, since we're talking about issues of race and class, the body positivity movement that tries to include fat bodies has been overtaken by
skinny people?
Yes. and mostly skinny white people. So, I wonder how you think about those movements or those spaces that are trying to form a narrative of being inclusive to fat bodies, but that are in fact contributing to the marginalization of them.
Well, I would first say that I don't think that most people in body positivity are trying to create space for fat bodies. They're trying to create space for themselves. And I get it. If you're not a size 2, you have some, there are some pressures to lose weight. We just tell every woman you need to go on a diet, no matter what that woman looks like. Any woman can be improved. That's not what I think. That's what this world seems to think. And so it's important to distinguish between body positivity and fat positivity. Because body positivity is a good idea, but it was meant for fat people to be positive about their bodies. And then a bunch of people who were like a size 8 were like, oh, look how positive I am on Instagram. And then they eat an ice cream cone. Fucking good for you. You're not it's like, first of all, I'm glad you're not lactose intolerant. But I'm also glad you're having a treat. And it's also really corporate. A lot of times it's trying to sell something, like these new comfort jeans or some bullshit Dove products. I think that we have to push back against that, because when people like that tell me, oh, you should be positive about your body, I'm like, really? Tell me more, please. And that's why I do try to use fat positivity, because it's important for fat people to recognize that fat is not a problem and it is not something that should be framed negatively. It's the world that tells us that fat is a bad thing and an overly medicalized, unhealthy thing. And so I'm really interested in that language that we're using. And I just, whenever I see someone like on Instagram that uses hashtag body positivity, I'm just like, delete.
And you know, it's mostly like the acceptable fat that is, you know, like the pear-shaped, curvy fatness that is exploited and that is, you know, elevated.
Oh, absolutely. It's a very specific type. It's something that is still desirable, something that people still want. And I really encourage anyone to do whatever they need to do to feel good about themselves. You know, life is hard, but wow. It's really frustrating sometimes to just see people using the same language and the same ideas about fat positivity and acting like they're being really transgressive. I don't know that you are.
Where are you finding joy right now? What are you doing to find your joy?
Drinking a lot. You know, I find joy in reading. I love reading. I find joy in television. A lot of joy. But mostly I find joy in my personal relationships. That's the source of my joy. Well, not the only source of my joy. Like, let's not put that much pressure on someone. But, you know, just the people I choose to spend time with, the main person I spend time with, my friends, absolutely. And yeah, that's where I find joy. And also my work. Even though my work is kind of depressing, my next several projects are very, very fun because I do need a break. And also because I hate this idea that if you're a person of color, if you're queer, that you are only about your trauma and that's the only thing you have to sell. I have plenty to talk about across a range of topics. And so I'm excited that I am in a place in my career where I get the opportunity to do that and know that I'll be supported. So that's where I'm finding joy these days.
And there's also something subversive, right, about a Black person or a brown person that is expected to be defined by their trauma to then bask in joy.
Absolutely, because people don't think we can be joyful or that we deserve joy. You see this a lot whenever people use the phrase black girl magic or black boy magic or black boy joy, which is so cute. Every time I see the phrase black boy joy, I just, you know, people push back and say, oh, not all black girls are happy and blah, blah. I'm like, girl, nobody's trying to answer for all black girls. But my 6-year-old niece, she's magical. And she's black, and she's a girl. So, black girl magic. It works. And we need to see more expressions of joy. I actually, this is not bragging, but I won an award last week. At the ceremony, we had to give a little speech, because some of the awards we knew in advance. This was one I knew in advance, and one I didn't. And I talked, it was for the Lambda Literary Awards, and I talked about how I want all the queer writers in the audience to remember the joy of writing, and that it doesn't have to be about suffering and pain and marginalization. And I say the same thing to young writers of color, and young or old, because I'm old. It's important to be joyful if you want, and to know that that choice is available to you, and that what you have to say through joy is as important as what you might have to say about your marginalization and subjugation. In fact, I think it's even more important and more subversive, because look at what's going on in the world right now. Joy is a choice, and a necessity, and I think it's the only way we're going to survive.
What are you reading right now?
Books. I'm reading, well, I'm actually pretty much done with Sing Unburied Sing by Jessamine Ward, which is really interesting. What?
Can you repeat it? I didn't hear.
Sing Unburied Sing by Jessamine Ward. And I put it off for a long time because I was jealous. And just being honest, I won a National Book Award very badly. I don't even think like I'm in her range. She's so good, which is why I put off reading it. And now I'm reading it and I'm just mad. It's so brilliant and it's lush and thoughtful and nuanced and brilliant. I'm loving it. So that's one thing I'm reading. And I am also reading How to Write an Autobiographical Novel by Alexander Chee, which is very good. And it's a forthcoming book of poetry by a woman named Damaris Hill called A Bound Woman is a Dangerous Thing, right? And it's amazing, and it's all about Black women who have been imprisoned in one way or another. And it comes out in the next 6 months. I can't remember the exact date, but just follow my Twitter because I'm going to be hyping it big time. So that's what I'm reading right now.
Speaking of your Twitter.
I don't know what you're talking about.
So you have these cryptic tweets about a nemesis.
Yes, I do.
We're curious.
I'm sure you are. You know, the thing about my nemesis is I will never admit who it is because it's so petty. And the reason I made this person my nemesis is because my person has a crush on them. And so I was just like, that's it. That's it. That's it. That's it. And it has developed into this really raging, passionate thing for me now, where when I see them like online smiling, I'm just like, this bitch. I just cannot. It is an epic rivalry for someone who does not know I'm alive. So that's what's going on in here. Everything's well.
So I saw your amazing interview with Jesus and Marrow.
Yeah.
And they asked you, what would Roxane Gay tell the younger version of herself?
Mm-hmm.
And you said,
Don't fuck with your eyebrows.
it's really good advice.
It's timeless advice. It's timeless.
In addition to that, what other piece of advice would you give to your younger self?
Don't fuck with your crotch hair. One day I was really bored and I went crazy with a razor. And it's funny because I like anytime someone's doing my makeup, they're like, oh, should I do something with your eyebrows? And I'm like, my eyebrows are flawless. This is natural, let it be. But also I guess I would tell my younger self, you are not the loser you think you are. You are going to become somebody. Because I sure needed to hear that, and I didn't when I was a teenager and in my 20s. And I think a lot of us need to hear that and to know that. I think you can have family and friends who have the best of intentions and who don't realize how much you're struggling with self-esteem and how much the world has tried to break you down.
Well, it's been an honor to share the stage with you.
Well, thank you. Likewise.
Thank you, Roxane. So we have a lot of people here today, so we're going to open it up for Q&A.
Oh my God, 500 women. You have to speak really close to it.
Hi, it's very nice to meet you. I love your writing and your style. I was curious, you said right now that we're nowhere, and in a hypothetical situation where you sort of ran the show, what would be like the 2 or 3 big things you do to get somewhere?
Mandatory sentencing for sexual violence-based crimes. Rehabilitation in the prison system so that we are not making better rapists. And doing something about making a culture where women are believed instead of doubted.
You made a comment about us not being ready for cultural criticism yet. And I've always noticed in your writing that there's a different voice for when you're, I think, maybe more internal and analytical. And what is the requirement to get from the messy experience to the place where it's sort of digested and can be analyzed more publicly and usefully?
I don't know, I think oftentimes it's distance. When I was looking at the submissions, it was, I just saw that people, it's not that we're not ready, but that people had more to say before they got to that. And I think in terms of sexual violence, because we are still in a culture where women are not believed, like until we get to a place where we're believed, we don't have the privilege of being able to take an intellectual step back to interrogate rape culture, because we're still suffering from rape culture. And so I think it's really about distance.
I have a question, but what advice do you have for young writers?
What advice do I have for young writers? I'd like to tell young writers to just be relentless, because that has been what has sustained me as a writer over the past 25 years. You can't give up. You're going to be rejected constantly, and that's normal. That's part of the job. And you have to find a way to deal with it. You can have feelings and feel sad about it and cry, Lord knows I do. But then you have to get back into the game and send your work out again and get back to your computer or writing device, or pen and paper if you really want to give it a whirl. You have to just get back. And you don't have to wait for permission. A lot of times people say, how do I find my voice? Like, it's not something you find, it's something you have that you tap into. And so don't wait for permission to write, and don't think you can't call yourself a writer. If you write, you're a writer. And also treat it like a job. I've always treated my writing like a job. A second job until recently, but a job nonetheless, which means that I took it seriously and I honored the appointments I made with myself to write. Like I honored going to work, and so you should take yourself seriously.
And you've just had such unprecedented success in the past few years, and I'm certainly not used to be among this many people when I go to see a writer. That I was maybe I just don't like people who are popular. But I'm wondering if that's changed either your ambitions or how your expectations of yourself.
Has my success changed my ambitions or my expectations of myself? I think it has only made me more ambitious, because with each success, I just think, okay, I've done this, and now I want to do more. And so I am a very ambitious person. I want to become a better writer, and I want to write, for example, I want to write something worthy of a Pulitzer, and I'm totally fine admitting that. Oh, thank you. But I want to get better, and I want to achieve more, and I want to move into other mediums. I'm moving right now into film and television, which is really fun. And I want something to happen in that arena. And so yeah, the bar is always moving. And I like that. I don't want to just sort of rest on my laurels and just do the same thing over and over again. That doesn't interest me. And in terms of my expectations, I do think it makes me unduly hard on myself, which I need to just chill out about. But there's a lot of pressure.
A lot about the danger of euphemisms when we use words like assault instead of rape, when we use words like white nationalism instead of racism for white supremacy. From an activist perspective, with the public here behind you, what do you feel like the thinking writing public's role should be in challenging that?
It depends, but in general, I think that we have a responsibility to be accurate and to be honest, and we're not seeing a lot of that. Even in the highest echelons of journalism, like Maggie Haberman can't call a lie to save her life. And, she's talented, but she's prioritizing access over honesty. And I think as long as we are more invested in access than honesty, we're in trouble. And so I think we just have to be honest, especially when we can afford it. Reputationally, professionally, financially. I'm not saying, sacrifice your whole life and, fuck your rent and your children, to be honest. But I think that there are a lot of people in powerful positions who can afford to be honest and should be honest and should call things what they are. And it's been really dismaying over the past year and a half to see how people are writing around the truth. And it's happening on both sides. It's not just conservatives or Republicans. We see it a lot with liberals too, and especially in the field of journalism. Like they all hang out and laugh and kiki together and then, pretend to be outraged. And like, no, if you were really outraged, you would write about the truth. So we just have to be more honest. How can we how can we expand the Me Too conversation to be more inclusive of male, trans, and non-binary survivors? We just have to be deliberate about it. We have to make sure that we are being as deliberate and inclusive as possible when talking about sexual violence. And it's going to take a lot of work because we just are not good as a culture about acknowledging that. Another thing we're not really good about acknowledging is same-sex domestic violence and sexual violence. That is definitely one hole in Not That Bad. There are genderqueer writers in Not That Bad, and so I felt comfortable with that, but there wasn't a lot of exploration of same-sex violence. And so we just have to be more deliberate and mindful.
My question is sort of jumping off that. What advice would you give an individual looking to not just confront their abuser, but the institution that has long protected them?
What advice would I give to someone who wants to confront their abuser and the institution that has supported their abuser? That's a good question. I don't know. That's a good question. I have never had the courage to confront my rapists. I think that you have to make sure that you are in an emotional place where you can handle it no matter what happens, and to recognize that you may have imagined a lot of different ways it can go, but you're not really ever going to get it right, and so you have to go in prepared for anything. And I think you should not do it alone, because that's just me. I would want someone there that I could trust and who could support and back me up. In terms of the institution, receipts, paper trails, evidence that they have acted poorly and that they have supported an abuser over the abuser's victim. And I think in general it's important to go public with institutions because that's the only way they respond when their reputation and bottom line are affected. So you need to go for the jugular with the institution. What book or books would I recommend for someone who is a survivor of sexual violence? I don't know what's currently out there in terms of therapeutic assistance. I don't know what the current day version is of A Courage to Heal. And the reason I'm not recommending A Courage to Heal is because back in the late 80s, early 90s, it was the gold standard, and then it was wildly discredited because it's fucked up. And it just turns out that the people who wrote the book were bad. So I don't know, but I don't know. Any fiction that you might find therapeutic? I'm so terrible at coming up with things on the spot. I'm just bad at it. But yes, no, really do tweet me because I do have tons of fiction recommendations. None are coming to mind, but if you tweet me, I will give you like 20. Thank you.
When you write fiction about sexual assault about impact on readers? Are you thinking about the truth of the characters, and how do you balance that?
Yeah. When I'm writing fiction about sexual violence, what am I thinking about? In general, I'm just thinking about the story. I try not to ever think about readers when I'm writing. I write for myself. I write the kinds of things I want to see in the world. And so I'm trying to think of ways in which I can honor the experience of sexual violence without being gratuitous and salacious, but also not glamorizing it and making it seem like a pleasant experience that just happened on a bad day, because that's not what it is. And I also try to be very careful about the language that I use. And I wrote a whole essay about this called The Careless Language About Sexual Violence, The Careless Language of Sexual Violence, which is in Bad Feminist. Because I was writing my novel, An Untamed State, at the time, and there had been this really horrible gang rape in Cleveland, Texas. And the New York Times wrote an article where they lamented the poor town and how the town was affected by this young girl who was 10 or 11 and raped by 27 men. Yeah, it was just truly one of those crimes that is so horrifying, and that they were worried about the town disgusted me. They actually ended up retracting the story and rewriting it the way it should have been rewritten, the way it should have been written in the first place. And so I just never want to do that. And I don't want to ever be terrible at it. So I'm just thinking about what the story needs, what the character needs, and how I can be ethical in writing the violence. How do I feel about teaching it? And yeah, I teach at Purdue, I teach at Purdue. For the past 2 years, I've taught one class a year. I'm actually taking this next academic year off because I can only do so much and I can only be in one place at a time. I love teaching. I love it. I especially love teaching undergraduates, which is always surprising to people, but we have a really good MFA program at Purdue, but undergraduates are more open-minded. They're more willing to take risks and take chances, and they don't think they know everything. And I say that with love because I love my graduate students, but it's just a difference, and it's just so pure. And they're wild. They'll write anything. They're just like fucking dogs in space. And I'm like, okay. Let's think about the structure then. I just love that. They challenge me and they encourage me to take risks in my own work, because when I see the wild shit that they come up with, I'm like, okay, yeah, I can write a novel. I can. It's joy, but I am getting to the point where I'm probably going to be leaving the academy because of time, and I want to write full time, and also because academia is really hard as a Black woman. It's just really, really hard, and I'm over it. I'm just over it. I'm privileged to say that. I have tenure. I can go back whenever I want, so like it's not a noble thing to leave, but I'm just over it. I'm over being the only one. I'm over having to constantly demand diversity, and there are so few Black students at Purdue. It's appalling, and I'm just over it. So I think I'm going to leave. In terms of advice I can't state enough how over I am. In terms of advice for teachers, I just think put great, exciting reading in front of them. Take chances. Every semester I try to change up at least 70% of my reading list. I always have some standbys for those days when I don't have time to prepare. But I try to always stay up to date on what's happening, and depending on I'm assuming you're in the humanities. So just, put exciting, challenging stuff. Don't be afraid to have uncomfortable discussions in the classroom. I love that, and I love being made uncomfortable, and I actually don't mind being challenged by my students. Purdue is a very conservative university, but the students, I have never had a problem. We get along really well because I tell them, I don't care what you think, I care how you express it. And that really makes them think. And then they work really hard to try and get me on board with gun control or something. And I'm like, sweet.
So I was wondering what advice you would have for people in the medical community on how they treat people with obesity in general, and medicalization of that, and how they can help victims survive this.
Advice for people in the medical community about how they treat fat people and also how they work with victims of sexual violence. You know, I think that it's very simple for doctors, nurses, and other medical practitioners. Treat fat people like they're human. And that seems really simple, but it doesn't happen. So many doctors are afraid of fat patients for various reasons. They're like, I don't know if I can handle all of that body. And I'm like, no, you can. Or you're gonna die. Stop doing that. Like if a fat person comes in for a sore throat, maybe give them some penicillin. Because I've gone into the doctor for a sore throat, and the first thing they wrote on my chart was obesity, and the second thing they wrote on my chart was strep throat, and I'm just like, okay, that's one way of going about it. And so just talk to people and don't assume that they're stupid. Fat people know what weight loss is. We know how to lose weight. We don't, that's not helpful unless they ask for it. If a fat person comes in and says, I would like to talk about my weight, then talk about it. When a fat person is not diabetic or doesn't have high blood pressure or any sort of comorbidities, believe them. And don't ask them 5 times, are you sure you don't have diabetes? Like, are you looking at my blood work, motherfucker? In terms of rape victims, I think just active consent about the entire medical process is really important. So I need to examine you. Let me get another person in the room. I'm going to lift your gown now. I'm going to do this. Like always give advance notice of what you're going to do in regards to their body so that they can prepare and, just get a little more strength to deal with it. And also just ask them, what kind of medical relationship would you like? What do you need? Oftentimes doctors think that they have all the answers, and the reality is, yes, you know a lot. You know way more than me, and I'm coming to you for a reason, but I'm also an expert on myself. So you can ask me questions, and if I trust you, I'm going to tell you the truth so that we can have a really productive relationship. And so just talk to your patients. Thank you. What resources do I suggest or have I found that uplift fat people from marginalized groups? The best resource I have found is the work of Sonia Renee Taylor, who wrote an amazing book called The Body Is Not a Problem. And she does all kinds of fat activism and really excellent fat positivity work. I met her at the Bay Area Book Festival last year, and she totally changed my way of thinking and just opened my mind and opened my eyes. It was just, she's transcendent. Also, your fat friend, that's her name on Twitter, and that's the name of her blog. I'm pretty sure she's white, but she talks about fatness and fat positivity in such an incredible way and an inclusive way, and she creates space for people from all walks of life. And so those are the 2 people I recommend.
Veering into more shallow waters, what is...
I'm there with you, I'm right there.
I swear I'm a critical thinker also, but what is currently bringing you joy on television?
I am watching Dear White People on Netflix. I'm so behind on everything. So Dear White People, and don't laugh, but Guys Grocery Games on Food Network, and also Martha Stewart is a judge on Chopped. I don't know, she started last week. It's so good. She just gets on the show and she's the same sort of interesting and haughty and bland lady that she is in life. And I really like Martha Stewart. She's interesting to me. But she's a judge on Chopped. And so that really makes me happy. Vanderpump Rules always pleases me. Brittany and Jax got engaged. And Ariana Grande and Pete Davidson got engaged. And so it's like, They're the four horsemen of the apocalypse. That's really interesting. I don't really watch prestige television. I watch trash. Thank you.
I just wanted to know your thoughts on Rihanna and so-called inclusive.
I love it. I have bought some items. Not necessarily for myself. It's not that inclusive, but it's more inclusive than a lot that's already out there. You know, people use the word inclusive because it goes up to 3X. Congratulations. What about those of us who are 6X and perhaps want to do something a little saucy for you? But no, it's really well made. It's beautiful stuff. And they ship really fast.
So I'm curious about, I feel like I don't know you, but as someone who admires your work, you seem to occupy a space in between being intellectual and being sort of activist. And I wonder if you think about those as related or two distinct identities, and what your relationship is.
Yeah, what's my relationship between intellectual work and activism? They're intrinsically tied. I use my writing as a form of activism because I actually don't really think of myself as an activist because there are actual activists out in the world doing that work. And I don't want to co-opt that space because I know I don't inhabit it. But I do feel mission-oriented in a lot of my writing, and I do recognize that I can contribute something to cultural conversations and hopefully expand people's empathy through my writing. And so that's the relationship.
I'm just starting to enter like the professional world as an adult, and really struggling with where to set boundaries. And I feel like you've really struck a nice balance. At least from watching your Twitter and the way that you engage in the topic, it seems like you've really nailed that. And so I was wondering if you had any guidance on where to start and how to build that scale.
I'm a work in progress. I'm really bad at boundaries in my actual life. But I think I'm learning about it. I'm back in therapy now, and I'm learning about boundaries. And for me, it starts online because it's easier. And hopefully that will trickle down into my actual life, even though we know trickle-down economics doesn't work. Hopefully trickle-down boundaries will. But the most important thing is to know what your boundaries are, and then to articulate them to people who need to know what those boundaries are, and then to find the ovaries to stand behind it. Oftentimes we have boundaries and we know them, but we relent because we don't want to be seen as unpleasant or as thinking too highly of ourselves or whatever. So you want to try and find ways to stand your ground. And sometimes you start small. For me, I started on Twitter. Like, no, you're not going to talk that way to me because I'm grown and I don't know you. And it really helped, and I'm getting better about it. Like at events, sometimes people are just like crazy with the cameras, and I'm like, I don't like having my picture taken. And I really recognize why you want to have a picture taken, and I'm very flattered, but no, you can't take my picture if I'm in a bad mood that day. And just sticking to that and not relenting, because so many times people say, oh, well, please, I drove here all the way from blah, blah, blah. And then I'm like, oh, but she drove all the way here. But is that more important than my right to have a boundary? No, it isn't. And so you have to start to recognize that you have a right to have boundaries. And it doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It means that you love yourself. Yes, do I find the balance between being a realist and a romantic difficult? Yeah, all the time. But I'm happy to be a romantic. I don't want to compromise that about myself. So it's challenging, but that's who I am. And so it's okay to be romantic. And we need more romantics in this world. We just do.
Those things that really interest you. I'm just curious what maybe or artists you like.
I've been listening to a lot of Pointer Sisters. So for you millennials, yeah. That's what's up. I just am really into the Pointer Sisters. Jump for Your Love, like, I can't not move. Like, that is some catchy shit. I've also been listening to a lot of Kendrick Lamar and Tank. I'm not proud, but right. Yeah, see my man there knows. And I listen to a little bit of everything, I must say. I am very omnivorous with my music tastes. I grew up in the Midwest, and so I have even dabbled in country. By dabbled, I mean I used to listen to country constantly. I don't anymore. It's changed. Brooks and Dunn, Garth Brooks, Chris Gaines. I don't know how many of you remember when Garth Brooks had his midlife crisis, but The Life of Chris Gaines is a really good album. And so I've been rocking that lately because I'm just like, he is so rich that he wrote a biography for a fake man named Chris Gaines, grew a soul patch, and toured the country as Chris Gaines when he was the top-selling country artist in the country. It's like, God damn, white people are fucked up. Thank you. What advice do I have for supporting friends who are survivors of sexual assault? I think follow their lead. And oftentimes when people are dealing with trauma, people say, what can I do? But sometimes you have to just do and not ask. Because, and I don't mean that in a way where you transgress boundaries, but when I'm depressed and when I'm in a bad place, I can't tell you what I need necessarily. So if you feel like there's something you can offer that isn't too intrusive, just offer it. But also be there to listen. Recognize that there are going to be good days and bad days, but don't see them only as a victim. Don't define them by what happened to them. Just like be like, hey, do you want to go watch Baywatch? The very bad movie? I just saw it on a plane, that's why it was fresh. Make sure that they can remember that they are more than their survivorhood. Thank you.
Hi. Recently, I learned that a man I volunteered with is a convicted racist. And while I haven't encountered him again, I'm not sure if I will. And I was wondering what your two thoughts on the matter.
I don't know. That's a tough one. I mean, stay away. Report him to does the organization you're volunteering with know?
I'm not really sure. I just know that he's creating a blog because he got no prison time. He just got community service hours.
I would tell the volunteer organization. That's the best thing you can do to protect other volunteers in whatever community you're serving. Just paddle. Like sometimes it's good to tell because you're not really. They may not know he's a convicted rapist. And so I don't know that you have to like walk down the street yelling, Peter's a convicted rapist. But I do think that this volunteer organization needs to know because I doubt that's someone that they want in their ranks.
So kind of going back to what you were talking about earlier about the they have happened. So, I guess my question is, how do you deal with the feeling of bitterness for people who have never experienced certain problems in marginalization?
I just try to remember that everybody is dealing with something. And I don't know that I ever feel bitterness. I feel jealousy. Like, oh, it must be nice. And then I remember, you don't know. You don't know their life. You don't know what they're dealing with. And so I would just say try to extend a little empathy unless they're annoying, in which case just be bitter. Yeah, I mean, we always try to what do I do to rid myself of unpleasant emotions? It's as long as it's not controlling your existence, maybe it's okay to feel better. That's healthy. You recognize that they have something he or she had, and be bitter about that, and then be kinder to yourself. All right, last but not least.
Thanks for the tweet, because I was stuck in traffic and it
Oh, you're the traffic girl, yeah.
So my question was kind of really straightforward. Do you hit a writer's block? What do you do? Where do you go?
I do. I've been dealing with writer's block. No one understands it, but I've been dealing with it for about 2 years now. And I've been able to push work through the block, but it's not my best work. And I'm missing my mojo, the thing that normally is the engine beneath my writing. It's hard, and so I cry about it, and I complain about it, and I try to write through it. I try to step away from the page and read, or go to movies, or do something else, go for a walk, and mostly though I just sit and try to grind through it. It sucks. And there are a lot of people that say writer's block doesn't exist, and I'm just like, yeah, you're there. So next you're going to tell me Santa Claus doesn't exist. if you're feeling it, it exists. And, just you have to try and grind through it or take a break. Oftentimes that space can help. Thank you. Thank you so much.